Good morning, everyone from Santa Monica, California. My name is Aaron Malas. I'm an Associate Director in the Center for Regional Economics at the Milken Institute. Very glad to be with everyone this morning for the next event in our webinar series with Global Wonks on the future of work. This has been a great series so far, looking at how jobs and the nature of work are evolving in the 21st century, both during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Our first events earlier this year covered the future of offices and the gig economy. Today we'll be talking about essential workers. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce our moderator, Terry McBride from Global Wonks.
Great, thank you so much. So today we're talking about essential workers, valuable or vulnerable. Before we get started, I'm Terry McBride. As Aaron introduced me, I am on the Advisory Council for Global Wonks, and it's my pleasure to participate. We're also joined by three panelists, and I'd like you to take a moment to introduce yourselves, please. Jim, if we could please start with you.
Sure. My name is Jim Araby, and I'm the Director of Strategic Campaigns for UFCW Local 5. We're a 30,000 member union based in Northern California. We represent workers across the food supply chain, from agriculture workers to grocery workers and everything in between.
Great, thank you so much. Jessica, if we could move to you, please.
Hi, I'm Jessica Chang. I'm co-founder and CEO of a startup company called We Care. We are a marketplace for childcare, and specifically we focus on helping families, specifically working families and essential workers, to find affordable and convenient childcare. And then on the other side of it, we actually help small businesses, childcare providers, actually create a business and operate that business efficiently so that they can provide great childcare back to those families.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And Josh, could you please introduce yourself?
Hey, how are you? I'm Josh Stevens. I'm VP of Product for Current. Current is a US-based challenger bank serving Americans overlooked by traditional institutions. Our core demographic is really the over 130 million Americans who live paycheck to paycheck in the US. And unlike other traditional banks or other fintechs, we build products specifically designed to meet their financial needs, which are focused around liquidity management and providing them with faster and better access to their money.
Great, thank you so much. So one of the things I'd like to point out for today is we've created this discussion to start at a policy level. And thanks to Jim, we'll really delve into that for about the first 20 minutes. And then after that, we'll also include Jessica and Josh to think about what it looks like from a practitioner level. And one of the things we'll encourage you to do is let's make this a discussion. So if you do have questions at the end, feel free to share them. So Jim, it was interesting to hear about your background. Can you tell me a little bit about the experience that you're bringing to this during the COVID pandemic?
Sure. So, I spent about a decade in Sacramento politics, first working with teachers and now working with grocery workers. And, it was interesting. I had transitioned to the local union to do more representation, bargaining, and organizing. And then the global pandemic hit, and it became a real interesting thing because we've always known that grocery workers and food workers have been essential to our economy's function, but it was never more clear than when the pandemic hit, and that was the only thing that was functioning in the beginning of this pandemic. But the other thing that sort of happened is, and it's interesting, you had a panel about this last time around, the gig economy, because essential workers and the gig economy kind of crashed into each other in a lot of different ways in 2020. From the policy perspective, in California, in 2018, we had a Dynamex decision that essentially reclassified a whole swath of workers from independent contractors to being W-2 workers. And, we had a big fight in the legislature to sort of codify that in 2019 around AB 5, where you saw this real separation of philosophy about how to treat workers, I think, and who's responsible for their health. Is it the individual or is it the corporation that they work for? And we passed this law, got it signed by the governor, where we reclassified a whole swath of gig workers. And that had a real impact on essential workers because, all these gig jobs were very much in the essential worker industries, grocery and, retail. And then 2020, we had both the global pandemic and Prop 22 on the ballot at the same time. And, I think what we saw from the policy perspective as well as inside these stores was, one, huge amounts of as the rest of the business shut down and the only gathering places to really go were grocery stores and later on retail stores, workers, our members, were more exposed to the coronavirus. There was a tremendous level of fear, amongst the workers. But then the workers were also pushed to be more productive. Grocery stores, for instance, reported increased profits year over year in March and April by over 100%. You had a ton of people coming into stores. We were running out of products, and our companies, even though we had vast layoffs in the rest of the the hospitality industry and the restaurant industry, you had an increase in employment. In the grocery industry, Amazon hiring was something like 1,500 workers a day. You had this tremendous amount of shift happening in the way that we work, but you also had a tremendous amount of a big debate around who's responsible for what within that workspace, right? And I don't think we've yet settled on that. Prop 22 goes through, Californians vote to make basically all these workers independent contractors. So all of that, now falls, all of this sort of individualism falls on the worker. So it's still unclear about paid sick time, getting impact, if you contract the virus, right? All these different things that our essential workers are going through, like in the Safeway, where we know the grocery store is on the hook for folks when it comes to their health, their public, their health insurance coverage, workers' comp insurance, paid sick time. And we passed a range of policies in Sacramento to deal with these issues that I can go into more. So there's a real, it's really interesting. So you sort of see everything sort of play out in real time in 2020 as it relates to the treatment of these, vital essential workers and who's responsible for what and the increase in demand on those people.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. So I live in London, England. It's interesting looking at the plight of essential workers. So some grocery stores have reported an increase in profit of 29%. And some grocery stores gave a 10% wage increase, which was, I think, welcome, but perhaps insufficient. So at a policy level, what are the bare minimum standards that should be in place for essential workers?
It's a great question. And I think in California, we did a decent job at that. I would say there's three main points. Number one, just starting off with the ability for workers to have access to expanded paid sick time. The likelihood, and I forget, this number is going to be off a little bit because it's probably changed, but when the global pandemic first happened, the likelihood of you as an individual who could shelter in place and work from home, the likelihood of you contracting the virus was something like 1 in 1,000, I think. Our members, grocery store workers, especially during this heightened demand, see between 500 and 800 people a day in a grocery store. And while, you have these plastic shields, social distancing, the interaction of people, is much, much higher. So you're much more likely to contract the virus. Just in our membership alone in the Bay Area of California, we've had over 700 members contract the virus at work. We've had about 7 of our members pass away, contracting the virus at work. So there's a huge risk, for essential workers. If you look, and that's just at a grocery store level. If you look, further down the supply chain, you've had those stories about in the food processing plants where, people were really worried about the production of food because the level of risk was so much higher inside these food production facilities because you couldn't socially distance, right? You had to be next to each other, the food supply chain. So there was all these stories in the spring and in the summer about, these outbreaks in these food supply, which we represent some folks. In the Bay Area, not so bad. But in Los Angeles, our sister local has had over 2,000 members contract the virus. And, and because they represent a lot of food production, it was a lot higher. So number one, I think, is access to expanded paid sick time. In California, we have a minimum of 3 days for everybody in the private sector. We were able to pass that for all essential workers to have 2 weeks, which, is not a lot, but it's better than 3 days. Unionized workers have access to an expanded paid sick bank beyond that. So that was number one, is expanded paid sick time. Number two was expanding the definition of how people could contract workers' comp. Because if you actually contract the virus in the job, we made the argument that it's a workers' comp issue. You got injured at work, right? And so the state of California passed an expanded workers' comp to cover essential workers, which was a huge thing. It was a big, big fight in Sacramento, but we were able to do that. And then the third thing, which we have not been successful at, but I think is necessarily important, is, to your reference of, hazard pay. There needs to be a level of hazard pay. There needs to be some level of incentive for workers to want to continue to come to work. If we are essential, then you should have some incentive for workers to be able to come to work. Originally, on the onset of the pandemic, the companies themselves were doing this. We had a range of pay, an increase in pay from anywhere from $2 to $5 an hour, or companies were bonusing people. When we lifted the shelter-in-place order in California in June, that all went away. We had one employer continuing to pay that still has continued to pay hazard pay. Outside of that, all the rest of the employers stopped paying hazard pay. And we were in contractual relationships, so we couldn't open up the contract to try to fight. We gathered petitions. Even Kamala Harris and Joe Biden came out with an op-ed, calling on companies to give hazard pay, and all these different things. But now what we're doing with this second, or whatever, the fifth wave, I don't know what wave we're in, we are now moving local ordinances across California for local governments to institute a hazard pay for grocery workers, and we're doing it at $5 an hour. We had San Francisco introduce the legislation yesterday, Los Angeles introduced legislation yesterday, Long Beach, and it's just we feel like we got to do this everywhere, and we're tying the increase in pay for these workers directly to the tiered status of our public health order. We're saying everything, as long as we're in above yellow, which is the lowest, there's a 4-tier, the lowest yellow, we're all in purple right now, that essential workers should be paid an additional $3 to $5 an hour, depending on where you are for working. So those are sort of the 3 tiers that I would say that we're trying to work at.
That's helpful. Thank you. That raises so many questions for me. So that sounds morally right, but from a financial perspective, who's going to bear the cost of this?
Good question. We think the company should. If you're increasing profits, I mean, the grocery store profits here are up 20%. And instead of reinvesting that profit in the employees, what they're doing, like Albertsons, they've now moved $1.5 billion of that profit back into the company by doing stock buybacks. So they're buying back the stock to artificially inflate their stock price, to pay the CEOs. Additionally, what they're doing, instead of investing in the workers, Safeway, which is a subsidiary of Albertsons now, Albertsons nationally, they used to have drivers, and we organized the delivery drivers. We just organized the delivery drivers during all this. So all the delivery drivers used to work for Safeway. They were employees of Safeway. Well, Safeway last week made an announcement, Albertsons made an announcement last week that nationally they're laying off all their drivers that aren't unionized, and they have now created a national contract with DoorDash. So they are now using contract workers to do the last mile delivery out of their stores. As their online e-commerce demand has gone up 247% this year. So they're increasing profits in their online channel, they're increasing profits in their brick and mortar channel, and they're relinquishing responsibility as much as they can of their employees. And when private enterprise doesn't do their job, and when unions, are pushing hard as best they can through their contracts, then it's government's role to create a shared responsibility, for these companies to sort of weigh in and invest in their workers. And so that's what we believe needs to happen.
Okay, thank you. Where do workers' rights and workers' choices play into this? Because in the UK, one grocery store, they hired 16,000 more people. So do those people have a choice to go there? Can they vote with their feet? What responsibility does the individual have?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's a fundamental question on everything that we do in this sort of economic system. You could say, sure, you have a choice to choose a job and work there or not. You have a choice to put yourself in that position or not. But I would say that's a privileged question, and not to you, Terry, but sort of as the broader question is, but do I really have a choice where I have to put food on my table? And if these are the only jobs available, right? If unemployment's at 15, 20%, I need to get a job, and these are the only jobs available. There's nothing else I could do but work there. And I think, and I would say an employer has a choice. an employer has a choice to say, well, do I want to make as much profit as possible, or do I want to be able to ensure the health and safety of my workforce and maybe invest a little bit more into my workers and make a little less? And I would say we have employers, I don't want to paint a broad brush and say everyone's evil, but we do have some employers that are making the choice of saying, you know what, we need to reward our workers. These workers are helping us make money, are taking care of our customers at a time when they're at this sort of time that's of uncertainty, and we're making more money. So you know what, we're going to give a little back to our workers, and that's what one of our companies has done since the beginning of this. Is they're paying the workers $3.50 additionally an hour. And when you make $20 an hour, when you make $21 an hour, that's a big change in your life, right? And so that I would say
it's interesting. So Jim, thing. Yeah, sorry, it's interesting tying hazard pay to tiers, and that's clear cut. And it's slightly less clear cut when we tie it to hazard pay or pandemic pay, because there's such confusion and such disbelief about the levels of lack of safety, etc. So how do we treat people in times of ambiguity? But I would say even more importantly, how do we treat people post-pandemic? What is the role of the essential worker going forward?
Great question. I think this pandemic has really exposed, in my mind, sort of the underlying challenges we have with the way our economy is structured. Where we rely heavily, where you see even a greater division amongst where people have the option to come into the office or work from home versus I have no option but to go to work, right? And what does that mean in a world where and those jobs are also more on the low paid side, right? And so I think it's really about, I think there's really two things. One is respect is a very important thing. We had a lot of members at the beginning of this who were reporting back. Customer service jobs are hard, right? Or if you work in a warehouse, it's hard. We had a lot of members report back that people would come in and say, thank you, right? People would come in and say, I appreciate you, right? Or companies would create appreciation pay. And that goes a far way. And it can't only happen when we're in this pandemic. I think we have to respect people's work at all times. And so it becomes this sort of, I think, philosophical change more than just a policy change about how we treat one another and how we value people's work. I think that's a really important thing. And how private enterprise also acknowledges the value of their workers, I think is really important. Not only to do it during a global pandemic, right, but to do it on an ongoing basis. And maybe we can come to a better place in our society where we have a little bit more respect for one another.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think you provided a great jumping off point to include Jessica and Josh. And Jessica and Josh, if you could join us now, and really from your perspectives, if you could first talk about what is the role of private enterprise during this pandemic, both serving essential workers, and then also what are some of our obligations to essential workers? Josh, do you want to go first? Or Jessica, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, what Jim's dealing with is like a first degree problem, right? How do we make sure that people get essential services and therefore grocery store workers are essential? I think when we look at it, and a lot of times there are different layers of essential workers. Ours are specifically teachers. And sometimes we forget that they're also essential because without childcare, a lot of people actually can't go to work. So you have a hospital worker, for example, that is literally taking their child because guess what? All the schools are closed and they're taking their child to the hospital. And it's just really unsafe. And what I mean by secondary is usually that's the second layer of like, well, now I've got people going to work. How do I keep them at work? And so they're not taking PTO because I've got to make sure my frontline people are going in. And it's actually interesting because for us, we felt that there was more of a need to support them now because they're actually serving frontline workers or they're serving children who, by the way, in most cases, maybe not so during COVID, but that is arguable, children are the biggest spreader of viruses, right? You can't tell them to just cover your mouth or wear a mask the whole time, and they're gonna sneeze on you and they're gonna touch everything. I'm sorry, I've got a 4-year-old, so he licks everything. But there's definitely what we've seen is, teachers are scared too, right? They're really scared. A lot of them are also older as well, so they're actually high risk. And when they look at their community, most of the times teachers do it because they love teaching, right? They've always been there, even when their pay hasn't increased for 20 plus years, they've always been there, right? Like they do this because they love to. And that's a big risk for them to say like, hey, I'm gonna keep my daycare open because I wanna serve my community. But myself, my husband, we're all high risk. So I'm bringing a high risk potential virus into my house. And I think for us, we saw that and we're like, okay, how do we support you to make sure that you feel comfortable and you feel safe? One of it is, when many parents during early March, when a lot of parents were just like, I'm not sure if I can send my child to daycare because I'm not an essential worker. So I just need to take my child out of daycare. That's substantially a big hit for someone that, that's their livelihood and they could lose their home because of it. So instead, we work with the parents to make sure that, hey, while you're taking a pause, you still want to hold your seat. So could you at least pay for half? We also worked with local governments in grants to actually get grants for these providers so that we can bridge the other half of pay. We also at the same time made our service available to them 24/7. So if they have any issues, call us 2 a.m. There's something that's going on, or you have a question that you don't know an answer, give us a call so we can support you. In addition, we also partnered with the likes of the city of LA, and they were looking to partner with someone to actually service essential workers during this critical time period. And we said, yeah, we'll do that. We'll help to make sure that our daycares also are helping their community as much as possible. And I think lastly, we were actually pretty proactive about keeping our daycare safe, but also keeping parents safe as well. So we actually launched in early March. So this was even before COVID really got into the US, a health screening app feature on our app to basically make sure that everyone was doing a health screening prior to the start of care. So you were essentially limiting as much exposure as possible. So I think, like, kind of coming back to that question, I think it's really important. And I think for us private companies, at least, or I can say for our startup companies, we've kind of taken the stance that we need to do more and we need to help more, because if we don't support this second degree worker, if they're not there, the whole system starts breaking down.
Great, thank you very much. I think you make a really interesting distinction between different tiers of worker. And I've also heard there's different distinctions about the type of essential work, and I would love to understand that more. Josh, I'd love to hear from you before we open up to your discussion. Please, if anyone has any questions or comments that they'd like to put in the chat, it's on the lower corner of your screen. We would love to see them. Just put them there and then we can pose them to the panelists. But Josh, what are you seeing from your perspective from banking?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to understand is that before COVID, right, we were seeing huge problems in terms of how the financial system plays a role for folks who live paycheck to paycheck and folks who make lower incomes. At Current, right, our mission is really about providing better financial outcomes. And like pre-COVID, we perhaps weren't talking as much about quote unquote essential workers, but that doesn't mean that there were not essential workers at that time. I think Jim brought up a really good point before about just providing respect. Right. And I think that there's something to be said for the fact that when we go into a grocery store, even prior to the point of thinking through when someone is putting their lives on the line to go there, there's not a whole lot of thought that I think most consumers give to what are those people's lives like. And you see that really clear in the financial space. So 50% of our members, or over 50% of our members, have never had a bank account before. Right. So this is people who have traditionally gotten a paycheck. They go to a check cashing place, they go to payday loans. They are trying very hard to not solve kind of year to year problems. They're trying to solve day to day problems. How do you get access to your money to pay off your bills, to help survive? With the onset of COVID, what we've basically seen is the need for hourly workers in grocery stores, big box retailers, delivery services. These have all skyrocketed, even though you've had record numbers of unemployment. These workers who almost entirely live paycheck to paycheck have been seeing their value rise. But when we talk about value, again, there's this question of value because they're providing a service that other people don't want to do. Whereas they still have to deal with significant problems. And so we've been helping keep a lot of these local communities going, because if you think about it from a banking perspective, if many of us wanted to go open a bank account, we can walk into a branch traditionally and do that. Branches, if you look in lower income communities, are in much lower demand. There's just not that many of them. When COVID hit, people didn't want to go to a branch. People are getting paychecks, they're getting unemployment, they're getting stimulus, they had a need to deposit something. And so Current basically has been sort of filling that gap, and we've seen a lot of growth around that, because a lot of these essential workers have needed a place to basically have the easy access to both receive and spend their money. I think to kind of your point around roles of private companies, and again, as Jessica was saying, really on the startup side, one of the advantages we have is we can be nimble, right? We can do things in a quick manner that other folks perhaps can't do. So the minute we sort of saw changes happening, this is really looking at March and April, Current in particular saw the need to build and launch features that could help these folks out, right? So that was everything from easy access to information on how to apply to stimulus checks. That was information on how to apply for unemployment benefits. That was abilities to link directly from the app into government portals, be able to check on those claims. We had a kind of dedicated section in the Current app directing members on how to access, anything they would need to provide the IRS in terms of for stimulus checks. We also made a conscious effort to credit government stimulus checks 5 days faster than a traditional bank would do, which is basically using our own balance sheet to do that. That was just to ensure essentially that we got funds into our members' hands as fast as possible. We also made those funds available right away instead of waiting for those to officially settle. This is basically us taking that bet that we know this is coming, and 5 days matters. I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding of like, oh, if you give more money to folks, they're gonna spend it on stuff that's not important. But that's not at all what we saw. We saw people spending on bills. We saw them paying off loans. We saw them paying groceries. These were essentially funds that were really, really needed. And I think the final bit I'd just add on there is, we also expanded, we have a free overdraft feature. As some of you folks may know, many traditional banks charge overdraft fees, but these are people who live on the line, right? There's never a huge amount of money in their bank account. And so we expanded our overdraft product to enroll basically thousands more folks in and allow them to overdraft up to $100 without any fees. That was really important because that's at a time when there's friction in the labor market. That's creating a situation where people need access to their funds kind of as fast as possible. And I think it's just important to understand that anything you can do from a financial perspective to put money back in people's wallets is critical now more than ever.
That's great. That's really helpful. Jessica, Jim, if you could come back on camera. One of the questions that we've received from audience members is, with some of the key innovations taking place during the pandemic, what are some of the ones that have helped? And Josh, I think you're making great examples of some of the key innovations that you've come up with. And Jessica, Jim, I'd love to hear from you, but what are some of those that should continue post-pandemic as well? Where do we go from here?
I think from the sort of worker side, I think when we projected the use of online retail, online delivery, Americans were very slow to adopt it. I think we were at 3% at one point, with the projection of getting to 15% by 2030 or something like that. And now we're already there. And so I think getting products, whether it's food or other things, to people more efficiently, that's an innovation. And I think it's here to stay post-pandemic. I think the question really becomes is, in that transition, how do we make sure those jobs are jobs that people can, survive on? And how do we ensure the health and safety of those jobs? And I think that's something that we have to really work through. And I think it's going to be a combination of ensuring that workers have a voice in that companies, play a role in that, and that the government also figures out how to, interact with that too. So I think that's going to be something that we're going to wrestle with and struggle through. And I think the other issue, and I think Jessica touched on this a lot. One thing that I didn't touch on is that the child care issue is a massively, massively important issue. We had a huge problem with that with our workers who can't take their kids to the grocery store or the food processing center or the field, right? They can't do that, So I think that's another thing that's here to stay and sort of hopefully elevates this, and it'd be important to figure out how do we deal with those issues. That's just from my perspective.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So I'm gonna definitely say what Josh was saying before, but I think prior to COVID, childcare was already an issue, right? Most of the US, we live in a childcare desert. For every 3 kids looking for care, there was only 1 spot available. So post-COVID or during COVID, it's become significantly worse. And you have centers and daycares and home daycares closing as well. So I think one of the things that kind of has evolved out of this, and what we've seen at least, is employers getting involved and employers actually saying, hey, we have healthcare benefits, but do we actually have childcare benefits? And that is something that we need to participate in and actually start doing for our employees, because if we can support them with childcare, we can increase productivity, we can increase retention, we can also increase the ability to attract new talent. And we've seen a significant increase in corporate benefits or childcare benefits starting to really solidify for employers. And employers are saying like, hey, this isn't a short-term thing. We always wanted to do this. I think COVID accelerated it for us. And we see this as a long-term to make sure that we give what we need to do to our employees. So that's definitely one of them. And you're right, like if we don't get employers involved on the childcare front, we're gonna see more and more employees just leaving, especially females leaving the workplace because they don't have childcare support.
Great, thank you. Another question came up, and it's about essential workers, really the taxonomy of essential workers. And we keep talking about the taxonomy, we keep talking about the types of essential workers, we're talking about the tiers. One of the things that the person poses is these aren't established terms. And let me read this off. And it seems this isn't established, that may be part of the problem, especially when it comes to barring social and policy interventions from one part of the country or even elsewhere in the world. I'd like to hear the panelists comment on this lack of clarity in taxonomy and also the tiers. So from that perspective, when we think about who is essential, how do we define that? Jim, how would you define that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Just pause for a second to try to think how to answer because it's a good question. I would say, I look at essential workers as providing some sort of service that without it would not, the society would grind to a halt, right? And if you look at that and you could tear it out, obviously, food workers, we had this big debate, right? When we shut down the economy, who's going to remain open, right? And so it started with food workers, childcare, all these sort of services that people need in order to move, right? So, but then it was like, well, what about cannabis dispensaries? What about retail? What about restaurants, right? So it became like this whole so who is really essential for people? So there are tiering. And I would say, essential to me is obviously people in the food supply chain. Well, if people in the food supply chain work, then you're going to need all their kids and families, the services, all the sort of extraneous services around that are also essential, right? Education, is that essential? Like public education and how we move forward with that, is that essential? Government services, fire, police, all those. So I would say sort of building from concentric circles out is like, what are the things that we need to survive, from, if they stopped, we wouldn't survive versus, more convenience and things that, socially we need to survive, right? And that's how I would really think about it. But clearly, there are, healthcare, fire, public safety, public health, government services, and, and people that supply our food are, I would say, 4 entities that we can't survive without as a society as the core essential, then building out from that.
Great, thank you. So Josh, one of the things that you referenced, your ability to serve essential workers. So when you think about essential workers, what taxonomy comes up for you?
Yeah, I think Jim kind of laid out well. I was sort of thinking, if we think about it as like a society's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? What's at the bottom, Meaning, who do we begin to determine as being most important to kind of keep things going? I mean, when I look at current and who we see coming through, it is very much those types of folks, right? It's FedEx workers, you have UPS, you have nurses, police officers, but then you also have like the DoorDash, Instacart, gig economy folks in there. You have a lot of the kind of grocery workers. And so in these cases, right, these are people who have been put into positions where they were on the front lines when so many people were in quarantine. These were people who we saw working more than ever in some ways, clocking in higher hours. And there is a question in there of, is that because of the demands that we have versus what is actually most important? And you know, I think for us, the most important thing is just ensuring for those people who who were thrust into that position, that they have the best services possible. And in our case, that we're providing them with their money in as transparent and quick a way.
Great, thank you. So Jessica, it sounds like from your experience, teachers are definitely essential workers. Who else would you put in that category?
So what was interesting is when we partnered with the city of LA, we were actually asked to define what essential worker was, because we had to give a priorities to essential workers for childcare. And we ended up coming with a terminology of this is a job that you cannot perform at home, meaning like you can't work remotely and do this. And you actually had to serve individuals that without this service would be in a dire situation. For example, a police officer, if someone is getting held up at gunpoint, they have to be there, right? Sorry, that's a more extreme case, but they have to be there. So we really prioritized in the beginning, and of course that definition sort of extended like what Jim was saying, like you have the police officer, and then from there, like, what does he need? But in the beginning, it was police, fire, healthcare workers, and then it became grocery workers, it became teachers who also needed help with their children. And then from there, it started to expand that definition of like people that had to be, for example, in Amazon's distribution centers, right? People needed things that were sent to their home so that they could have toilet paper. And those were also considered essential. So there was different degrees, and we looked at it as first as like, hey, you can't work from home. What is something that has to be done? Without you, someone might die. And then it worked kind of going from there.
Great, thank you. So when we reflect on the experience of essential workers, and it's great that all three of you have stepped in to assist essential workers, but when we think about their experience during the pandemic, has their experience proven that we need a basic level of government assistance, or have we proven that a patchwork quilt of assistance is going to get us through? What do you think we've learned through this?
You know, from my perspective, I think more than ever, it has shown that we need a collaborative effort versus government, private enterprise, and the individual. You know, and you can see, you know, and you can see where those holes have happened. So, for instance, just, you know, another example is, you know, we have a lot of people that that are suffering a lot of sort of anxiety and mental health issues. Right now, there's no mental health services to take care of folks as they work through this, right? And so, so then they call out sick. So then all of a sudden, you need more people to come in, right? So it's like, you know, it becomes a challenge even to meet the demand. You know, so I think there's sort of like, if we don't have a real discussion about how we interact, government, you know, government, private enterprise, and the individual, you know, I think we're going to continue to have this tension, right, about, you know, who's responsible for what. You know, I mean, you could look at it on the housing crisis, right, as people, you know, as jobs go away, people can't afford their rent. You know, and then, you know, then we had the government have to step in and say you can't evict anyone because we're shutting everything down, right? And so I just feel like there's not an either-or equation. And I think if you look at, you know, the extremes of one end and say it's the individual, well, you know, to Jessica's point, not every individual can work from home, right? Like I don't have a choice. I have to work. And if I don't have protections at work, then how can I work? Or if I'm, you know, so I really feel like it's not an either-or. It's like, if now more than anything it's shown that we need more collaboration between those three entities, not less. And if we don't have it, then we're gonna suffer.
Yeah, I would just add on to that, there's something we've been seeing again prior to COVID, but it's certainly exasperated now, but there's a wealth inequality gap in the US that continues to grow. And it's very hard to provide better financial outcomes for people if they fundamentally don't have access to any money. And so if you put people in a position where they are forced to do things where they don't otherwise want to do, and you have minimum wage that is where it is, which is particularly low in certain parts of the country, it's very difficult to expect people to try to kind of improve where they are and try to get out from a mountain of debt. And that I by the way, totally agree with Jim on this. So you kind of need a collaborative effort there, because it's not just going to happen with one sector of our society.
We have so many questions backing up. Jessica, if you could also reflect on this, and also if we could think about what can we be doing post-pandemic, some very tangible steps that we might be able to take forward.
Yeah, so I'm in agreement 100%. I think there has to be a collaborative effort. I think what we saw early on was that it was left for every state, city, and county to fend for themselves. And to be honest, what ended up happening was you'll see certain cities that completely locked down and other cities that didn't lock down anything. And with that, you create a lot of animosity from people where they're like, well, my business had to shut down, or my restaurant had to shut down, and look at this other city that's never had to shut down. Like, what's going on? So it really does have to come from a collaborative effort that everyone works together with and also agrees upon, and that is consistent across every single state, city, and state. Because this pandemic is not choosy. It's not like, hey, I'm in California, so it's only going to affect Californians. It affects everyone, and it doesn't care how rich or poor you are. It's gonna come. And I think going forward, this really, it's put a spotlight into the holes, right? The multitudes of holes in our system that has been tested and has kind of broken down. And so I think going forward, there are different things that people are going to consider. I think one, people are going to reconsider childcare. I think people are also going to reconsider, and I think it's probably here to stay for many companies, is remote work. Do we need to have people in offices, or can people work from home and have more flexible schedules so that they can take care of their family more and they can have a balance of work and family? I also think, just like 9/11 affected how we travel, I think this pandemic is going to affect how we think about healthcare and having healthcare, and then also screening for healthcare. Because one of the things that we've seen is, because of our health screening, we've also seen a reduction in illness across the board in our daycares and our schools from everything. Kids are just not getting sick anymore as they used to. And that's an interesting trend that I don't think we talk about, is that if we actually implement a really simple health screening, that we can essentially quarantine someone that's sick and not have them spread that illness across the school. So there's a lot of things, and I think COVID accelerated the need. I don't think we were ready for it, but it definitely accelerated the need. And come springtime, I hope those needs actually are here to stay.
Great, thank you. Josh, what would you add to that?
I think it's important to understand that for us, like, COVID has been an accelerant in the adoption of mobile banking, and it's been an accelerant in the adoption of mobile banking, particularly within lower income communities. And I think that's important because traditional banks have set up a business model that has a higher cost of servicing accounts, which has resulted in basically them having to charge higher fees. And if we come out of this in a world where people don't expect their bank to charge them fees, and in fact, it can be a transparent kind of free experience where they get services that help them improve their outcomes, then that can be really positive. But it's important for us to continue to understand that.
Thank you. Oh. No, keep going.
No, just, yeah, that's basically it.
Sorry, internet seems to be breaking up a little bit. Jim, what would you add to that?
I love both what Jessica and Josh said around this idea of how these sort of these moments, these inflection points change everything the way we do, right? So 9/11 was an inflection point of how we looked at ourselves, both in terms of how we travel and how we look at ourselves as from an American perspective, Americans, right? And sort of what happens across the ocean actually impacts us here. I think the pandemic is another inflection point about how we work and how we interact with each other and how we communicate with one another. And I think we're seeing all the tension that is underneath has been bubbled to the surface. We really have we still have a 20th century, post-war 20th century regulatory model trying to fit into a 21st century economy and all of that tension that comes with it. And I think if we don't give up our sense of individualism and don't have a further, group of sort of, we have a collective responsibility to one another around, surviving all these other challenges. I think we're going to have a real problem. And I'm hopeful because there are a lot of conversations like this happening. There are a lot of people that are beginning to realize these different things. But I also give a pause as you look at sort of the debate happening in the American electorate, in this last election cycle. So there are two different realities, that people are living in. And how do we pull everyone back together to say we have a shared responsibility to survive? If we can't deal with the challenges of a global pandemic, how are we going to deal with the challenges of the climate crisis, the continuous separation of rich and poor, and all these other things that are much more opaque than an issue related to sort of, I get COVID, I could die, right? So to me, what we need to think about as we move forward is acting as an individual, while important and critical to sort of how we survive. We cannot think about that as a community. And if we don't pull together and really tackle all these challenges and feel a shared responsibility, who knows what's going to happen. So I think that's what needs to change as we move forward, is how we think about ourselves in the broader community.
Great, thank you very much. So when we think about how we come together as a community, one of the questions that's been coming up on the chat is, what role does technology play in either bringing us together or else separating us? It's very easy for some people to separate with technology. For other people, it's easy to come together with it. So how do we use technology going forward?
I guess I can jump in on that. It's a great but very difficult question, right? Because technology can be a tool or a weapon depending on how you utilize it. And so there's no doubt that there's a lot of huge benefits for how we connect people, for how we tackle some of the problems that Jim just laid out. But I think doing so in a way that is cognizant of unintended consequences and is, I guess, mostly clear in sort of the type of challenges we're trying to solve, as opposed to something that is some sort of one-size-fits-all solution, which I think has proven in the past to be quite difficult to do effectively.
Thank you. Jessica, what would you add?
Yeah, I think technology has the ability to really provide interconnectedness, especially during this time where there's never been such a bigger divide in our country. And we're already seeing, people adopting grocery deliveries, right? This was probably what Jim mentioned, 3% of people in the past. Now it's probably 70 to 80% of people are using it, not because they wanted to, but because they had to, and it forced them to actually really understand it. And I think, why we, as Josh and I, why we love technology companies is because they are nimble and they have the ability to solve real issues and solve it in a way that is scalable to large groups of individuals and more efficient and provide more benefit. So I think it's right to say, we have the ability to really bring people together and help solve a critical issue, especially for those that have been left out of the discussion, but we have to do it consciously. And we have to know that, hey, some of the things that we do could could harm people and really be responsible for that too. So I think there's going to be an evolution of socially conscious technology companies that are driven by mission and mission impact.
Great, thank you very much. Jim,
Yeah,
what
you know,
would you add to?
Sorry. I would just add that I think, Jessica, that was a good way of putting it. I mean, for me, technology is a tool, not a philosophy. You know, it's something that is to be used, not to be used as a tool. You know, I look at it as, you know, and us individuals and humans and people need to understand how to use it as a tool to have its greatest impact. You know, if you look at sort of Silicon Valley, you know, and Google, when it was first founded, it was like, do no evil. Well, they got rid of that, right? Like, they got rid of that philosophy, and now you have all these questions related to Google and information and sort of artificial intelligence. So for me, we have to get back to that discussion of that. How do we use technology as a tool to bring people together, not further divide people? And I think that's sort of the outside conversation happening with everything, whether it's using social media platforms or whether it's using DoorDash, right? Like, how do we use these tools to bring people together to make people's lives better, you know, on the whole, not individual? And that sounds very like high-minded, but I think we can do it. I think that was the original intent of a lot of these tech companies. And as Jessica and Josh, you know, show, I mean, there are tools out there that are trying to make people's lives better. And I just think we have to push that and reward that behavior, you know, and create incentives for that behavior and not reward the other behavior, which is, you know, the further division, you know, further stratification.
Great, thank you. Again, some of the questions coming up is, what is the role of universal basic income? And Josh, I will say this was directly directed towards you, so I'll let you start, but then if Jessica and Jim, if you could also comment.
Yeah, so I mean, without wading too much into that, I guess I would just say that if we are going to look at how we improve financial outcomes, if we're going to look at how we improve financial lives, I think it is important that we look at what the wages are of people who are particularly, you know, this conversation around essential workers. What are the wages there? And I think that right now, if you're going to be able to offer folks better access to assets, better access to money, better ways to dig themselves out of certain holes, you're going to need to take a look at what those wages are. And I think that we have like a real responsibility right now as a society to understand that we need to pay more, and that minimum wage in particular needs to be higher. How that comes in with something like universal basic income, I think that is one of the solutions being thrown around there. And that is certainly something that would, in my opinion, disproportionately impact in a positive way folks who right now really struggle to make ends meet. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Jessica, what would you say about universal basic income?
I actually really love that idea, to be honest. And, you know, I think we tried to do it. We distributed a $1,200 stimulus check, and we did it within 2 or 3 weeks. So we have, if we actually work together, we do have the potential to actually really start thinking about just a universal basic income. Because, you know, our company was started on the premises of that preschool teachers weren't getting paid enough. Like, they're making $20,000 in a year, and they take care of our most prized possession, which is our children, and they work 9 hours a day and get paid minimum wage. How is that fair? And, you know, that's what we were trying to answer when we were creating We Care as a company. So I think for us, our biggest belief that if you pay people well, they end up happier, they end up staying longer at their jobs, they are able to support their families and get out of poverty. And there's so many studies that show that if we actually help those individuals rise out of poverty, it actually helps society as a whole, and it brings the overall economy up higher. So if there's a financial sense to it, then there it is. And I'm a big believer of it, and I wish we can put that discussion back on the table.
Great, thank you. Jim, what would you add?
You know, I'm skeptical of universal basic income. I think it, depending on how it rolls out, it sort of puts the responsibility solely on government again, instead of private enterprise. I think private enterprise has a lot. I mean, you need to pay your workers a fair wage, right? You need to share in the profits and the productivity that workers actually create. And it can't just come from government. It can't just come from taxation through government to people. I think corporations have a responsibility to their workers, in a real way to reward their work. I also think politically it's a real question because, as you can see, Michael Tubbs, who instituted universal basic income in Stockton, California, right, through a series of grants and foundations, is no longer mayor of Stockton. So there's a political question. I'm not saying it was right or wrong. I'm just saying there's a political question around that. Now, he lost for other reasons, right? But, we really have to look at the political implications of instituting something like that, along with the economic ones, and who ultimately shares that responsibility. I think we need to not solely rely on government providing, every, a basic service. I think government needs to make sure that there's shared responsibility in this. And so I'm not sold, and the last thing I would say on universal basic income is, I think there's an importance in meaning to work, right? And there's a real clear importance in meaning to work, and people derive value from producing something. That's natural, right? And so I think we have to also answer that question in this broader sense of how do we actually provide some basic level of standard of living, and whose responsibility is it?
Great, thank you. That sounds like a terrific final comment from you. Jessica, what would be a final comment from you?
I agree with Jim that it's not the responsibility of government, but, when I look at it, really we look to government to say like, hey, give us direction, help us, guide us on what are the right proper things to do. I think government should rethink about how they're taxing big corporations, right? I think that's what's sad. It's like in California, for example, we were actually trying to pass a law to tax corporations more on their real estate, so it would drive more income to the state of California, and literally we didn't pass it. And so the question really, I don't think the question is like, hey, it has to be on the individual. I think the concept of universal basic income makes sense, but it has to be bought in by not just individuals, not by the government, but also corporations, because majority of that funding would actually come from large corporations.
Great, thank you. Josh, what would you add?
I'd just say that, for us, I look at it from the point of view of people have to be paid a living wage. And right now, in order to pay that living wage, we have a number of ways to look at it. And to me, that needs to be a collaborative effort, right? That needs to be a collaborative effort between the private sector and the public sector. It needs to be on us as individuals to do our part to sort of improve that. And what that does, it helps improve people's outcomes, improves their lives. And I think that's something that we all need to kind of take into account.
Great, thank you. I think you're ending on a terrific note of collaboration. So let me say thank you to the three of you for collaborating with Global Wonks and Milken, for participating in this conversation. So Jim, Jessica, Josh, thank you very, very much. For all of our participants, thank you. Terrific hearing or seeing your questions. I'm sorry we could not get through all of them. I truly wish we could have probably 2 hours for this discussion. If you're interested in additional webinars, please do contact, again, Global Wonks and Milken. And the other email you can contact is matt.putnam@globalwonks.com. We'll also put this in the chat for anyone who's interested. But again, thank you so much for joining us. And Jim, Jessica, Josh, thank you very much.